The secret weapon nobody's talking about. How Kelvin Sheppard plans to fix the Lions' defense in 2026. Welcome back to Detroit Scope. And folks, we've got a juicy one for you today because Kelvin Sheppard just stepped up to that podium and basically handed Lions fans a blueprint for how this defense is supposed to transform in 2026. And buried in everything he said was a name that most casual fans have probably never heard of, a name that could quietly become one of the most important storylines of this entire Lions season. Stick around because we are diving deep into what Sheppard revealed, why it matters, and why one undersized defensive tackle in particular might hold the key to whether this defense actually takes the leap everyone in Detroit has been begging for. Let's start with the obvious part first, because honestly, it barely needs explaining at this point. Offensively, the Detroit Lions are going to be good. Full stop. Even in a season where the offensive coordinator situation got clunky and the offensive line took its lumps, Jared Goff still delivered an elite level. Because that is simply what this offense does now. When you have Amon-Ra, St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, and Jahmyr Gibbs rolling out of bed every single Sunday, this group does not need to be schemed into success. Gibbs can wake up and rip off an 80-yard run before his coffee even kicks in. That side of the ball has too much talent, too much continuity, and too much proven production for anybody to genuinely worry about it. The story of this Lions season, the thing that will actually determine whether Detroit competes for a championship or gets bounced early again, is the defense. And Kelvin Sheppard knows it. So when Sheppard addressed the media recently, he did not tiptoe around it. He came out and made it clear that real changes are coming, starting with how Detroit uses its nickel package. If you're not steeped in the schematic weeds of the NFL, here is the simple version. A nickel defense means you pull one of your linebackers or a defensive lineman off the field and replace him with an extra defensive back, giving you 5 defensive backs instead of the standard 4. It is the modern answer to a league that throws the ball more than ever, and it is exactly the kind of look that dominant defenses around the NFL have leaned into. And here is the part that should genuinely alarm Lions fans looking back at last season. Detroit played more snaps in base defense, meaning 3 linebackers on the field, than any other team in the entire NFL. We are talking 62.6% of defensive snaps in base personnel, the highest rate in the league by a wide margin. Compare that to the Seattle Seahawks, the team that just won a Super Bowl behind a defense that used base personnel on a jaw-dropping 6.4% of snaps. Let that sink in for a second. The champions of football played nickel or more defensive backs on the field basically every single snap of the season, while Detroit was stuck running the same 3 linebacker look over and over and over again. Sheppard has openly admitted he studied the very best defenses from last season during his off-season self-scout, specifically pointing to Seattle, Houston, and Jacksonville as teams he pulled tape from. He said plainly, "You want to know what people at the highest level of this profession are doing," and he was not going to pretend Detroit already had all the answers. That is a refreshingly honest admission from a coordinator, and it tells you Sheppard understands exactly why his defense struggled at times last year. His scheme became predictable. Teams knew Detroit was going to line up in that same heavy, run-stopping look no matter the situation, and offenses adjusted accordingly. Third and long on Thanksgiving, opposing quarterbacks knew exactly what they were getting, and they made Detroit pay for it more than fans want to remember. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because the nickel position itself lost its primary occupant this offseason. Amick Robertson, who played that role for Detroit basically full-time over the last 2 years, left in free agency for the Washington Commanders. That means the Lions had a legitimate hole to fill, and rather than treat it as a problem, Sheppard is framing it as an opportunity. In his own words, this is a chance for growth, both for the defense and for the team as a whole, because Detroit is not locked into assuming one specific player owns that job. Instead, the Lions went out and collected options. They signed veteran cornerback Roger McCreary in free agency. They added safety help through Christian Izien and Chuck Clark. They drafted Keith Abney, the second out of the draft, specifically with nickel snaps in mind. And through organized team activities this offseason, one name has consistently separated himself early. Roger McCreary has reportedly gotten the most reps with a first-team defense at nickel corner, and Sheppard himself has publicly praised him, calling him a guy who has popped early in this process. Think about what McCreary actually brings to the table here. This is a crafty veteran who has already logged over 3,000 career snaps in the NFL, someone who has experience playing both outside a cornerback and inside in the slot. That versatility matters enormously in today's NFL, where offenses are constantly trying to create mismatches and force defenses to declare their intentions before the snap. If McCreary can lock down that nickel roll the way early reports suggest, Detroit suddenly has real answers at cornerback across the board, pairing him with Terrion Arnold and DJ Reed on the outside. That is a completely different look than what Detroit trotted out for stretches of last season, when injuries and inconsistency turned the cornerback room into one of the defense's biggest liabilities. But cornerback and nickel usage is really only half of this story. And honestly, it might not even be the half that determines Detroit's ceiling this year. Let's talk about the trenches, because this is where things get spicy, and this is where that name from the thumbnail comes into play. Detroit's defensive front is loaded with size at defensive end. Aidan Hutchinson stands 6'7". DJ Wonnum comes in at 6'5". Peyton Turner is 6'6". Rookie Anthony Lucas measures in around 6'5" as well. That is a lot of long, rangy pass rushers who can set the edge and get their hands up in passing lanes. Then you've got Derek Moore, a bit of an outlier at 6'3", but with notably good arm length for his size, a prospect who spent what felt like forever at Michigan before finally declaring, and who flashed real playmaking ability during his college career. There's a fair debate to be had about whether Moore lives up to expectations, especially since some of the same doubts once existed about Hutchinson himself before he became one of the best young pass rushers in football. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because defensive tackle is a completely different conversation. Alim McNeill has looked like himself again after working his way back, and that alone is enormous news for this front, because a healthy, explosive McNeill changes the math up front in a serious way. Tyleik Williams is also someone the coaching staff is counting on to take a real step forward as an interior force. But after those two names, things get murky fast. Levi Onwuzurike has faded so far into the background that casual fans might have forgotten he is even still on the roster, a stunning fall for a former second-round pick who was once viewed as a potential building block on that defensive interior. And that brings us to the name that deserves way more attention than it has gotten so far this offseason. Skylar Gilbert-Howard, a sixth-round pick out of Texas Tech, a defensive tackle who stands just 6 feet tall and weighs around 280 pounds. In a league where defensive tackles are often massive, load-bearing space eaters, Gilbert-Howard is undersized in almost every meaningful measurable. His relative athletic score, the metric scouts use to compare a player's testing numbers against others of the same position, comes back fairly poor when stacked up against the rest of the defensive tackle population. But here's the twist that makes this story worth telling. There has only ever been one truly elite example of a defensive tackle built like this succeeding at the highest level, and his name is Aaron Donald, arguably the greatest interior defensive lineman to ever play the position. Same height, same weight range as Gilbert-Howard. Obviously, nobody is claiming Detroit's 6th-round pick is the next Aaron Donald. Donald was elite in literally every other athletic category that matters: explosiveness, get off, hand strength, all of it, which is exactly why he became a generational outlier despite his size limitations. Gilbert-Howard has not shown that same kind of otherworldly athletic profile. But the comparison illustrates something important about roster building in the NFL. Sometimes a franchise-altering talent slips through the cracks specifically because he does not look the part on paper. Every single team in a league passes on players who go on to become superstars elsewhere, and Detroit has had its own version of that story before, watching quietly as certain draft classes reshaped entire franchises around a handful of hits while the misses simply faded into forgettable roster depth. That is precisely the crossroads Detroit finds itself at along the defensive interior right now. If McNeill is fully back to his disruptive best, if Tyleik Williams takes the leap the coaching staff is hoping for, and if even one of these lower-profile names, whether it's Gilbert-Howard, Mekhi Wingo, or somebody else buried on the depth chart, gives Detroit anything resembling consistent snaps, this defensive front stops being a question mark and start being a genuine strength. And if that happens, it changes absolutely everything about how this defense can operate schematically. Suddenly, Sheppard does not need to overload the back end with aggressive, high-risk man coverage looks just to compensate for a lack of interior push. He does not need to ask his cornerbacks to play bump and run press coverage on every single snap because his front four cannot generate pressure on their own. Instead, Detroit can play a more conservative, sound, disciplined defense, the kind that keeps everything in front of it, forces long developing plays, and lets a talented front do damage while the back seven reads and reacts rather than gambling. That contrast matters enormously because Detroit's aggressive man coverage tendencies became a real vulnerability last season. When opposing offenses knew Detroit was in man coverage, which frankly became fairly predictable, quarterbacks who might not otherwise be considered elite decision-makers were still able to identify favorable matchups and simply throw receivers open against tight coverage. There is nothing more frustrating for a Lions fan than watching an average quarterback pick apart a supposedly talented secondary simply because the defense tipped its hand before the snap. Sheppard seems to understand this exact problem, which is why expanding nickel usage and diversifying coverage shells is such a meaningful adjustment heading into this season. And look, the timing could not be better for this defense to take a real step forward, because the schedule gods have been unusually kind to Detroit this year. After finishing fourth in a brutal division and having to play one of the toughest schedules in football last season, facing stacked opponents like the Eagles, Rams, Chiefs, and Ravens, Detroit gets a significant change of pace in 2026. Outside of divisional matchups, the Lions face only a handful of teams that actually made the playoffs the year before, while getting to line up against several bottom feeders who combined for one of the worst records in the league. That is a golden opportunity for a defense in transition to find its footing, work out its kinks against lesser competition early, and hit its stride by the time the truly difficult stretches of the season arrive. Of course, no conversation about this defense would be complete without acknowledging the uncertainty still hanging over the safety position. Brian Branch continues working his way back from a torn Achilles, and Kirby Joseph's own knee situation remains murky at best heading into training camp. Both players represent massive talent at the safety spot when healthy, arguably one of the best safety tandems in the entire league, but Detroit may have to navigate the opening portion of this season without one or both of them. That puts even more pressure on this revamped cornerback room and this retooled defensive front to hold things together in the meantime, which only reinforces why Sheppard's adjustments at nickel and his hope for growth up front matter so much right now. Put it all together, and you have a defense at a genuine inflection point. The offense is not going anywhere. That side of the ball is locked in as one of the best units in football regardless of who is calling plays. The defense, though, has real, tangible paths toward becoming something special. A more diversified nickel package led by a proven veteran like Roger McCreary. A defensive front that could be transformed if names like Allen McNeil, Ty-like Williams, or even a long-shot developmental piece like Skylar Gilbert-Howard start hitting on a more consistent basis. And a schedule that gives this retooled group every opportunity to find its rhythm before the toughest stretches of the year arrive. If even 2 or 3 of these storylines break in Detroit's favor, this defense stops being the punchline it occasionally was last season and starts becoming the missing piece that turns the Lions from a talented team into a legitimate championship contender. So Detroit Scope faithful, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Roger McCreary locks down that nickel job for good? Is Skylar Gilbert-Howard going to be this year's unexpected diamond in the rough? Or is he destined to be forgotten depth like so many defensive tackles before him? And who is your favorite deep cut, under the radar Lions player from years past? The kind of guy who is not Barry Sanders or Calvin Johnson, but someone who had that one incredible stretch you will never forget. Drop your answers in the comments below, because we love reading through them and hearing what you all remember. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to Detroit Scope if you have not already, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update as training camp approaches and this defensive transformation starts playing out in real time. We will see you in the next one.